"We are looking for leaders, not men living in trailers," the county emergency coordinator said, sliding Ethan Walker's application aside before the meeting had even started. Several people around the table nodded. Nobody noticed Ethan quietly stand up, thank them for their time, and walk out without argument. The storm warning sirens had not sounded yet, but dark clouds already stretched across the Texas sky. By tomorrow, that decision would look very different. Ethan stepped into the parking lot and climbed into his aging pickup truck. The truck had more miles than he cared to count, but it still started every morning. Just like him. He glanced at the clock before pulling away from the county building. He had exactly 22 minutes to get to his daughter's school. In the school hallway, parents crowded around bulletin boards and classroom doors. Ethan arrived carrying a toolbox in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. His 12-year-old daughter, Emma, was waiting near the front office. "Sorry I am late," he said. The compressor at work decided it had other plans. Emma smiled. "You still made it." They walked together toward the parking lot as teachers locked classroom doors behind them. Rain began tapping against the windows. Ethan noticed a maintenance worker struggling with a loose section of fencing near the playground. Before leaving, he spent 5 minutes helping secure it. No unknown cement. No credit. Just one less thing that could become a problem later. On the drive home, they stopped at a grocery store for milk, bread, batteries, and canned soup. The weather forecast on a television above the checkout lanes showed a growing storm system pushing toward town. Shoppers filled carts with bottled water and supplies. Ethan compared prices carefully before placing items into the cart. Responsibility had taught him how to stretch every dollar. A utility bill folded inside his jacket pocket reminded him of that reality every day. Yet when he noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach a case of water, he quietly lifted it into her cart and continued shopping before she could properly thank him. The small acts came naturally. That evening, wind rattled the windows of his modest home outside town. The house had once belonged to his late father. It was older than most homes in the area, but sturdy. Ethan checked the backup generator, tested emergency lights, and inspected the storm shutters. Emma watched from the porch. "You always do all this before storms." Ethan gave a small nod. Preparation is easier than regret. The answer sounded simple. Somehow it did not feel simple. Inside the garage, shelves were lined with organized equipment, emergency supplies, first aid kits, portable radios, and carefully labeled storage bins. It looked less like the garage of a maintenance technician and more like the command center of someone trained to handle crises. Emma never questioned it. To her, this was simply Dad being Dad. As darkness settled over the countryside, a local news report flashed across the television. Meteorologists were now predicting severe flooding and dangerous winds overnight. Phones across town buzzed with emergency alerts. Ethan stepped outside onto the porch and looked toward the horizon. The storm front was moving faster than expected. Then his radio crackled. A neighbor's voice came through, nervous and uncertain. Several roads were already becoming difficult to pass. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Calm, focused, intentional. The same look he had carried years earlier in places nobody in town knew about. Places he almost never talked about. Emma noticed it immediately. "Dad!" Ethan looked toward the gathering storm clouds. In the distance, lightning briefly illuminated the countryside. Then he turned back toward the house, already making decisions nobody else had begun making yet. Because before the night was over, 15 strangers would arrive at his door, and the entire town would be forced to discover who Ethan Walker really was. The first heavy drops arrived just after 9 o'clock. By 10, rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown from the sky. Ethan moved through the house with quiet efficiency. He checked flashlights, tested batteries one final time, and secured the last storm shutter while Emma organized blankets in the living room. Neither of them panicked. They had practiced for nights like this. The difference was that tonight felt larger, more serious. The emergency alert on Ethan's phone updated again. Flood warnings, road closures, evacuation recommendations for low-lying areas. Emma watched him study a weather map spread across the kitchen table. Colored markers highlighted roads, bridges, and elevation points around the county. "You made that?" she asked. Ethan folded the map. "A long time ago." It was another answer that revealed almost nothing while somehow suggesting much more. The radio crackled again. This time, it was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow from 3 houses down. Her furnace had stopped working, and the temperature was falling quickly. Ethan grabbed his rain jacket without hesitation. "Stay here," he told Emma. 10 minutes later, his pickup truck rolled through sheets of rain toward the small farmhouse. The roads were already beginning to flood. Most people would have waited until morning. Ethan climbed under the house with a flashlight and a tool bag while rainwater streamed through the yard. 25 minutes later, warm air flowed through the vents again. Mrs. Henderson tried to hand him money. Ethan smiled and shook his head. "Save it for groceries." By the time he returned home, the storm had intensified. Tree branches bent sideways under powerful gusts. The lights flickered twice before stabilizing. Emma handed him a cup of coffee. He thanked her and glanced toward the utility bill pinned beneath a magnet on the refrigerator. Every dollar mattered, yet he had just spent nearly an hour helping a neighbor for free. Responsibility had always outweighed convenience in Ethan's world. Near midnight, another call came through the emergency radio network. A family of 4 was stranded at a church parking lot on the south side of town after floodwaters blocked both directions. Local emergency services were overwhelmed. The dispatcher sounded exhausted. Ethan listened quietly. Then he stood and reached for a waterproof storage case hidden on the garage shelf. Emma followed him. Inside were laminated maps, communication equipment, weather instruments, and emergency response checklists. Everything was meticulously organized. Not like a hobby, not like someone guessing, like someone who had done this professionally. Emma noticed a patch sewn inside the case. Most of the lettering had faded with age. Only a few words remained visible. "Incident Command." She looked up at him. "Dad, where did you learn all this?" Ethan paused for half a second before closing the lid. "Different life." Again, the answer ended there. Yet the mystery continued growing. Outside, sirens echoed somewhere beyond the rain. Ethan contacted the stranded family through the radio network and guided them toward a safer route using back roads that most residents had forgotten existed. Nearly 40 minutes later, the dispatcher radioed back. The family had reached safety. The relief in her voice was impossible to miss. "Whoever helped them probably saved us several hours tonight," she said. Ethan simply signed off. No name, no recognition, no explanation. But somewhere inside the County Emergency Operations Center, one exhausted dispatcher had begun wondering why a maintenance worker seemed to understand disaster response better than many trained officials. Then another message arrived over the radio. This one sounded far more urgent than the others. Ethan listened carefully. His expression changed, and for the first time that night, Emma saw genuine concern in her father's eyes. The urgent message came from a county dispatcher whose calm professionalism was beginning to crack under pressure. A shuttle bus carrying several travelers had become stranded near an access road outside town. Rising water had blocked the main route. Emergency crews were already handling multiple incidents across the county. Help would not arrive quickly. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then he unfolded one of his weather maps across the kitchen table. Rain rattled against the windows while Emma watched him trace a route with his finger. "There's an old service road behind the grain elevators," he said into the radio. "If the driver can reach it, they can make it to higher ground." There was a brief silence on the other end. "How do you know that road?" the dispatcher asked. Ethan glanced toward the storm-dark window. "It is still there." The answer was enough. 20 minutes later, another voice came across the radio. This one was unfamiliar. Female. Calm despite obvious stress. "This is Claire Bennett. I am with the stranded group. We found the road." Ethan immediately noticed the difference. Most people spoke emotionally during emergencies. She spoke carefully, organizing information as she delivered it. "How many people are with you?" he asked. 12 adults. 2 children. 1 elderly passenger with mobility issues. Ethan wrote every detail down. His questions came quickly. Fuel level, vehicle condition, water depth, wind direction, road visibility. Claire answered each one precisely. Emma watched from across the room. The conversation sounded less like a maintenance worker helping strangers and more like two experienced professionals solving a problem together. The old pickup truck sat ready in the driveway, while emergency radios continued humming from the garage. Outside, floodwaters crept across nearby fields. Inside, Ethan guided the group toward a safer location one step at a time. Claire listened closely. She did not argue. She did not panic. And, somewhere during those conversations, she began noticing something unusual. This man understood risk assessment, logistics, communication, and emergency planning at a level that did not match the life he appeared to live. Nearly an hour later, the stranded travelers reached an abandoned maintenance station on elevated ground. It was not comfortable, but it was safe. Claire radioed back immediately. Relief softened her voice for the first time. "We made it." Ethan nodded, even though she could not see him. "Good. You sound like you have done this before." The question lingered. Ethan looked toward a faded photograph resting on a shelf in the garage. The frame faced away from most visitors. Emma had seen it many times, but rarely asked about it. "A long time ago," he replied. Claire waited as though expecting more. None came. At the county operations center, several officials had now gathered around the dispatcher's desk. They were listening to every transmission. One of them recognized the terminology Ethan had been using throughout the night. Another noticed how accurately he predicted road failures before official reports arrived. The same people who had dismissed his leadership application hours earlier were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Meanwhile, Claire sat inside the stranded shuttle, watching rain stream down the windows. She was exhausted, cold, and worried about the people depending on her. Yet she found herself thinking about the quiet man on the radio. He never raised his voice, never demanded attention, never mentioned credentials. Still, everyone seemed safer whenever he spoke. Then a new emergency alert appeared on Ethan's radio. A larger problem was developing west of town. Much larger. Ethan studied the message once, and for the first time that night, he realized his home might soon become the only safe shelter within miles. And if his calculations were correct, strangers would start arriving before sunrise. The rain continued through the early morning hours without mercy. Roads disappeared beneath rising water. Power outages spread across the county one neighborhood at a time. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, studying weather reports while Emma heated canned soup on the stove. The emergency radio buzzed constantly now. Calls for help, status updates, road closures. Every piece of information fit into a larger picture forming inside Ethan's mind. He did not like what he was seeing. "The western ridge is going to become isolated," he said quietly. Emma looked up. "How do you know?" Ethan pointed to 3 different maps, rainfall estimates, and flood reports arriving from separate locations. The conclusion seemed obvious to him. To everyone else, it would not become obvious until hours later. Before he could explain further, another transmission arrived. The stranded travelers had been moved again. Conditions at the maintenance station were deteriorating. Claire Bennett's voice sounded tired but controlled. "We need a new location." Ethan already had one in mind. "Bring them here." Emma did not seem surprised. She simply stood and started gathering extra blankets. The house was small. Money was tight. The utility bill still sat on the refrigerator door. None of that changed the decision. 2 hours later, headlights appeared through the rain. Vehicles slowly pulled into Ethan's long gravel driveway. The first arrivals stepped carefully through puddles toward the porch. Others followed. Vet jackets, exhausted faces, nervous children, an elderly man leaning on a cane. Ethan welcomed every person inside with the same calm courtesy. Coffee was brewed. Blankets were distributed. Dry towels appeared from closets. Nobody was turned away. Claire arrived near the end of the group. For the first time, she saw him face to face. He looked exactly like the kind of man people overlooked every day. Work-worn hands, simple clothes, quiet posture. Yet nothing about the organized operation unfolding around him matched that first impression. Within 20 minutes, sleeping areas had been assigned, medical needs identified, food supplies inventoried, and emergency communication procedures established. Ethan moved through the crowded house with effortless coordination. Claire noticed people naturally following his guidance without being told to do so. Then the doubt arrived. One of the stranded travelers recognized Ethan from the county meeting earlier that day. "Wait," the man said. "Aren't you the guy they rejected for that emergency leadership position?" Several heads turned. The room grew uncomfortable. "If the county did not trust him, why should we?" someone else asked. Ethan remained silent. He continued carrying bottled water from the garage as though he had not heard the comment. Claire watched carefully. Most people would have defended themselves, explained, argued. Ethan did none of those things. The criticism landed and passed without changing him. Yet the question lingered among several guests. The county had dismissed him. There had to be a reason. Later that morning, while helping organize supplies in the garage, Claire noticed something partially hidden behind storage shelves. Framed certificates, professional commendations, advanced emergency management credentials. Most were old. Some had names and organizations she recognized immediately. Before she could read them fully, Ethan gently moved a stack of equipment in front of them. Not defensive, not ashamed, simply private. The moment lasted only seconds, but it changed something. The picture no longer fit, not even close. Then another radio transmission echoed through the garage. The county operations center was requesting assistance. Not from emergency leadership, not from county officials. They were specifically asking for Ethan Walker. And for the first time, even Claire looked genuinely surprised. The request from the county operations center arrived twice within 5 minutes. The second transmission sounded noticeably different from the first. Less confident, more urgent. The same officials who had dismissed Ethan's application now needed information they did not have. A flood control gate west of town was malfunctioning. Water levels were rising faster than projections. Several neighborhoods could soon become trapped. Ethan listened carefully while standing beside the workbench in his garage. Around him, strangers rested under blankets. Children slept on air mattresses, and coffee brewed continuously in the kitchen. His home had become a shelter before sunrise, exactly as he had predicted. Claire stood nearby, organizing supplies. She watched him study the situation. His eyes moved across maps, rainfall reports, and handwritten notes with remarkable speed. Then he reached into a storage cabinet and removed a weather binder. The cover contained a faded county seal. "How old is that?" Claire asked. "About 12 years. Ethan opened it. Inside were engineering diagrams, floodplain studies, evacuation routes, and infrastructure assessments. Not the kind of documents a maintenance worker would normally possess. Claire looked closer. Several pages contained detailed annotations written in Ethan's handwriting. "You helped create these?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. For a moment, it seemed he might avoid the question again. Instead, he quietly nodded. "A long time ago." Before Claire could ask more, the radio crackled. The county needed an answer immediately. Ethan studied one page, then another. Finally, he gave precise instructions regarding the gate mechanism, drainage channels, and water diversion points. The dispatcher repeated the information word for word. 30 minutes later, confirmation arrived. The solution was working. Water levels had stabilized. Several threatened roads remained open. A collective sigh filled the room. But the biggest reaction came from the county operations center itself. Someone there had pulled old personnel records. Someone had discovered exactly who Ethan Walker used to be. Claire first noticed the change when a new voice came over the radio. Respect had replaced skepticism. "Mr. Walker," the official said carefully, "we found your previous emergency management files." Silence settled across the garage. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Emma looked up from the dining table. She had never heard those words before. The official continued. "You led regional disaster planning projects across 3 states. Claire stared at him. The room suddenly felt smaller. "You designed half the flood response protocols we still use today." Another pause. "And you declined a federal leadership position 12 years ago." Nobody spoke. Rain tapped softly against the garage roof. Somewhere in the house, a coffee maker clicked off. Claire remembered the county meeting. The rejection, the dismissive comments, the assumptions. None of them made sense anymore. Ethan simply leaned against the workbench. There was no pride in his expression. No bitterness. Only quiet acceptance. Finally, Claire asked the question everyone else was thinking. Why would someone walk away from all that? Ethan glanced toward Emma. The answer was immediate. My wife became sick. My daughter needed me. The room fell silent again. Not because the explanation was dramatic. Because it was simple, honest, human. He had not failed. He had chosen responsibility over recognition. Later that afternoon, while checking supplies near the mailbox at the end of the long driveway, Claire found herself looking at Ethan differently. Not as a maintenance worker, not as a mystery, but as someone whose sacrifices had been invisible to nearly everyone around him. Yet even as that realization settled in, another challenge was already approaching. New flood reports were arriving. Conditions were worsening beyond every forecast. And according to the latest emergency update, hundreds more residents might soon need shelter. Ethan studied the numbers once. Then his expression changed, because he already knew the county was running out of options. By late afternoon, Ethan's house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a command center. Weather updates covered the kitchen table. Handwritten lists lined the counters. Charging stations occupied every available outlet. The garage had become a supply depot filled with bottled water, blankets, flashlights, and emergency equipment. Outside, rain continued falling across the county with relentless determination. The county operations center now contacted Ethan almost every hour. What began as occasional questions had evolved into something very different. They were following his recommendations. More importantly, they were seeing results. Roads he predicted would fail had become impassable. Neighborhoods he warned about required evacuation. Safe routes he identified remained open while others disappeared beneath rising water. Nobody could dismiss those outcomes anymore. Yet Ethan seemed unaffected by the growing attention. He spent the afternoon repairing a portable heater for an elderly couple staying in the living room. When a young mother worried about running out of diapers for her toddler, he quietly added her needs to a supply list. Responsibility remained his focus. Recognition did not. Claire watched all of it. The more she observed, the harder it became to reconcile the man in front of her with the assumptions she had made only hours earlier. She found him in the garage reviewing flood reports beside the same aging pickup truck that had carried him through years of ordinary life. "The county trusts you now," she said. Ethan continued marking locations on a map. "The county trusts information. That is not the same thing." He offered a faint smile, but did not argue. The conversation ended there. Yet Claire found herself thinking about it long afterward. Most people who had been overlooked the way Ethan had would have demanded acknowledgement. Instead, he seemed interested only in solving problems. Shortly before sunset, a new obstacle emerged. The largest community shelter in the region, located near a church parking lot on the north side of town, lost power and backup communications. More than 100 residents were staying there. County officials struggled to establish contact. Confusion spread quickly. Ethan studied incoming reports for less than 5 minutes before outlining an alternative communication network using volunteer radio operators scattered across neighboring counties. The plan was unconventional. Several officials questioned it immediately. One supervisor even argued that it was too complicated. Ethan calmly explained each step. No frustration, no ego, just facts. An hour later, communication with the shelter was restored almost exactly as he predicted. The same supervisor who had challenged him sent a direct message through the dispatcher. "Tell Mr. Walker thank you." The words carried noticeable humility. Meanwhile, Claire discovered another detail. While helping Emma organize storage bins, she found old newspaper clippings tucked inside a box. Most focused on disaster preparedness projects from years earlier. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly. Community leadership awards, regional planning initiatives, emergency response innovations. Yet every article ended abruptly around the same year. The same year his wife became ill. The realization settled heavily in Claire's heart. His disappearance from public life had not been failure. It had been sacrifice. That understanding changed something deeper than admiration. It created respect. Outside, Emergency vehicles moved through the rain-darkened roads. Inside, dozens of strangers shared meals around folding tables, while children colored pictures beside lanterns. For a brief moment, the shelter felt stable, safe. Then a new report arrived from the county. Water levels had exceeded every projection. Several evacuation centers were reaching capacity. Hundreds more residents were searching for shelter. Ethan read the update once. His jaw tightened slightly. Claire noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the crowded rooms inside the house. Then he looked back at the forecast. "This storm is not finished with us yet." And as another emergency alert sounded across every phone in the room, it became clear that the hardest decisions were still ahead. The emergency alert changed the atmosphere inside the house almost instantly. Conversations became quieter. Parents checked their phones. Volunteers gathered around the kitchen table, where updated flood maps were spread beneath lantern light. Outside, the storm continued pressing against the county like an uninvited force that refused to leave. Ethan studied the newest reports while Emma distributed sandwiches to exhausted families. The numbers were worse than anyone expected. Several evacuation centers were nearing capacity. More residents were being displaced every hour. Claire stood beside him, watching his eyes move across the data. It was becoming familiar now. The way he absorbed information. The way he connected details others overlooked. The way he seemed to anticipate problems before they appeared. Then a call came from the County Operations Center. This time they were not asking for advice. They were asking for leadership. "We need someone to coordinate volunteer shelters," the dispatcher said. "Nobody has a clearer picture of conditions than you do." Several people inside the room overheard the request. A few exchanged surprised glances. Just 24 hours earlier, the same county had rejected him. Ethan remained silent for a moment before agreeing to help. Not because it would restore his reputation, because people needed help. That distinction mattered. Over the next 2 hours, volunteer shelters across the region began communicating through a system Ethan designed using radio operators, church networks, and local businesses. A diner owner offered food deliveries. A grocery store manager opened emergency inventory. Several church parking lots became distribution points for blankets and supplies. Somehow, pieces that had been scattered across the county started working together. Claire watched it happen in real time. The results felt almost impossible. Then another discovery emerged. During a conference call, an older emergency management director recognized Ethan's name immediately. "Wait," the man said. "Walker." There was a pause. "You are the Ethan Walker?" The room grew quiet. Ethan looked uncomfortable already. The director continued anyway. 10 years ago, his regional disaster response model became a national training case study. Claire blinked. Several volunteers looked toward Ethan. The director was not finished. Half the coordination procedures we still teach were built on his framework. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that arrives when assumptions begin collapsing. Claire suddenly understood why the maps, the planning systems, the communication structure, and the calm decision-making all felt so natural to him. He had not simply participated in emergency management. He had helped shape it. Yet even now, Ethan redirected the conversation back toward shelter logistics within seconds. No stories. No explanations. No attempt to impress anyone. Later that evening, Claire found him outside near the mailbox at the end of the long driveway. Rain had finally weakened into a steady drizzle. Emergency vehicles moved along distant roads. "You could have told people who you were," she said. Ethan looked toward the dark horizon. It would not change what needed to be done. Claire smiled softly. That answer somehow explained everything. For the first time, she no longer saw a mystery. She saw character, the kind built through sacrifice rather than achievement. Yet not everyone was convinced. A county official who had opposed Ethan from the beginning remained skeptical. During a radio briefing, he questioned whether one private citizen should have so much influence over emergency decisions. The criticism spread uncertainty among several leaders. Recognition was growing, but resistance had not disappeared. Ethan heard every word and said nothing. He simply returned to work. Then, just before midnight, a new report arrived that drained the color from several faces in the operations center. A critical evacuation route was about to fail. Hundreds of residents depended on it. And according to the latest projections, there was almost no time left to act. The report arrived just after midnight. The Eastern Evacuation Corridor, the last reliable route connecting several flooded neighborhoods to higher ground, was beginning to fail. If it closed, hundreds of residents could become isolated. Ethan studied the data for less than a minute before identifying an alternative solution. A network of county service roads, farm access lanes, and maintenance routes could still move people to safety if coordinated immediately. The plan was complicated. Timing would be critical, but it could work. Claire watched him explain the strategy during an emergency conference call. Every recommendation was supported by maps, weather patterns, and infrastructure reports. Yet before he could finish, the same county official who had questioned him earlier interrupted. "We are not turning emergency operations over to a private citizen." The room fell silent. Several leaders hesitated. Others clearly disagreed, but said nothing. The official continued. "If this plan fails, the county will be responsible." Ethan did not argue. He simply answered questions. Calm, precise, respectful. But the delay cost time. Valuable time. Outside the house, rain began intensifying again. Inside, families sleeping on couches and air mattresses had no idea how close the situation was becoming. Emma sat at the dining table organizing supply lists while volunteers prepared coffee and breakfast items for the morning. The house remained a shelter, a responsibility Ethan refused to abandon. Yet now he was being pushed away from helping solve the larger crisis he understood better than almost anyone. By 2 a.m, officials chose a different strategy. Ethan listened quietly as the decision was announced. His recommendations were set aside. The alternative plan relied on routes Ethan had already warned would become unreliable. Claire saw the disappointment in his eyes for the first time. Not because he had been ignored, because people might pay the price for that choice. An hour later, the first reports arrived. Road closures, vehicle delays, communication problems. Exactly the failures Ethan had predicted. The operations center became increasingly chaotic. Calls flooded the network. Requests for assistance multiplied. Yet pride and bureaucracy moved more slowly than rising water. Claire found Ethan standing alone in the garage beside the workbench where everything had begun. The faded certificates remained hidden behind storage bins. The emergency maps were covered with fresh notes. His shoulders looked heavier than they had all week. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. Ethan stared at the weather reports. Knowing something and being able to change it are different things. The answer carried a sadness Claire had not heard before. For years, he had accepted being underestimated. But this was different. Now, the consequences affected people he felt responsible for protecting. Meanwhile, another problem emerged much closer to home. The county informed shelter operators that overcrowding concerns might require relocating some residents. Ethan's property was being evaluated because it had taken in more people than originally reported. Claire immediately understood the implication. If officials forced relocations during worsening conditions, families who finally felt safe could lose that security. Emma overheard part of the conversation. For the first time since the storm began, fear appeared on her face. This shelter was not just a building. It was her home. Ethan knelt beside her. "We will handle whatever comes." His voice remained steady, but Claire could see the strain behind it. He was trying to protect strangers, support his daughter, maintain the shelter, and help a county that still struggled to trust him. By dawn, exhaustion hung over everyone. Then the message arrived. The official evacuation strategy had officially failed. Multiple communities were now stranded. Hundreds of residents needed immediate assistance. The same leaders who had dismissed Ethan's plan were requesting an emergency review. Across the county, people were finally beginning to ask a difficult question. What if the quiet single father they had ignored from the beginning had been right all along? And as the first light of morning pushed through the storm clouds, the answer was about to become impossible to ignore. The emergency review began just after sunrise. Rain still fell across parts of the county, But the worst of the storm was finally moving east. Inside Ethan's crowded home, families gathered around radios and phones waiting for updates. Coffee brewed continuously in the kitchen. Blankets covered couches and folding chairs. Children who had arrived, frightened, now played card games on the living room floor. The shelter had become something more than temporary refuge. It had become a community. Ethan stood at the kitchen table, surrounded by maps and reports, as county officials joined an emergency conference call. This time, nobody interrupted him. Nobody dismissed him. They listened. He outlined the alternative evacuation network he had proposed hours earlier. Service roads, agricultural access routes, maintenance corridors, volunteer communication links. Everything connected. Everything supported by data. Within minutes, county leaders authorized implementation. Volunteer operators moved quickly. Church parking lots became transfer points. A grocery store distribution center opened supply routes. Local businesses coordinated transportation assistance. The same framework Ethan had quietly built throughout the storm now stretched across the entire county. Claire watched it unfold from across the room. Every recommendation produced results. Every decision created order where confusion had existed before. By late morning, stranded residents were moving safely towards shelter locations. Communication systems stabilized. Supply deliveries resumed. The crisis that had seemed impossible only hours earlier was finally turning. Then came the moment nobody expected. During a countywide emergency briefing, the director of emergency management requested permission to address everyone on the network. Hundreds of people were listening. Shelter operators, volunteers, officials, residents. The director's voice carried unusual emotion. Before the storm ends, there is something people need to know. Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. Claire noticed it at once. So did Emma. The director continued anyway. Several years ago, the disaster response framework that helped guide this county through the last 48 hours was created by one man. A pause followed. Many of us used that framework without realizing he was living right here among us. The room grew quieter. The director spoke Ethan's name. Then he described the truth. How Ethan had helped design regional disaster planning systems. How he had trained emergency leaders across multiple states. How he had declined a prestigious federal leadership position after his wife became seriously ill. How he had stepped away from recognition, advancement, and public success to care for his family. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room simply listened. Then came the final revelation. This storm could have been managed more effectively from the beginning if we had listened to him sooner. Silence settled over the house. Deep silence. The kind that arrives when pride finally gives way to truth. Several residents looked toward Ethan. Some remembered questioning him. Others remembered doubting him. One man quietly lowered his eyes. Claire felt her throat tighten. She understood now that Ethan's greatest sacrifice had never been his career. It had been accepting years of being misunderstood without allowing bitterness to take root. Emma looked at her father with tears in her eyes. Not because she had learned something new about him, because everyone else finally had. Later that afternoon, the county official who had opposed Ethan arrived in person. His truck rolled slowly into the driveway beside Ethan's aging pickup truck. The man walked through the crowded shelter and stopped in front of him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he extended his hand. I was wrong. Simple words. Honest words. Ethan shook his hand without hesitation. No victory. No dissentment. Just grace. The gesture seemed to affect the room more than any speech could have. By evening, evacuation efforts were largely complete. Families began returning home. Volunteers packed supplies. Children hugged Emma goodbye. The storm that had brought strangers together was finally ending. As the sun broke through the clouds, golden light settled across the property. Claire stood beside Ethan near the mailbox at the end of the driveway. The world felt quieter now. You saved a lot of people, she said. Ethan looked toward the house where Emma was laughing with several families. A lot of people helped. Claire smiled. That answer no longer surprised her. Respect had become something deeper. Trust. Understanding. perhaps the beginning of something neither of them needed to define yet. Nearby, county workers were already discussing future planning meetings. Several leaders hoped Ethan would return to a formal role. Whether he accepted remained uncertain. What was certain was this: the man they had dismissed because of an old pickup truck, a modest home, and a quiet life had become the person everyone depended on when it mattered most. And in the end, the storm revealed something more powerful than expertise. It revealed character. Because dignity does not need to announce itself. Integrity does not demand attention. Quiet strength rarely asks for recognition. Yet when the moment comes, truth has a way of speaking for itself. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needed the room to notice him at all.